Hi, welcome to episode 29 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we are using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe on the channel page and give us a thumbs up in this particular episode. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please give us a follow and a rating on this show. And of course, check us out on Instagram at American Tributaries Podcast. Before we start today's conversation, I'm proud to say that episode 29 is sponsored by Duo Plus Cafe, a lovely place in my neighborhood of Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, owned by David Lee and his wife Feng, their chef. This Dirty Rose latte is their drink, which I'm enjoying right now. So if you're in Brooklyn, please pay them a visit and get some delicious food and great drink, knowing that you're supporting some great local business and some great local people. They're located at 272 Court Street, just a few doors down from Union Market. Okay, so today I am so very thrilled to be joined by a longtime friend and neighbor, Carolyn Gartner, who I've known since our children went to kindergarten together. Carolyn, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
When you ask a therapist, how are you doing? You're going to get like an honest answer.
And we're up.
How am I doing? So I'm going to say I am excited to be here. I'm really excited. So a little bit of a nervous excitement. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to have you on. I appreciate you having the chance to talk to you, because I think that mental health and well-being really kind of roared to the forefront of people's awareness. I think with the pandemic, I think it's always been there. And like when my parents were getting divorced back in the 80s, like I did go to like a psychiatrist. I don't know if I ever felt it was as taboo as it was then, but I still think it was something that people haven't taken seriously. So I think the more we can hear about your profession, the better.
Yeah. And thank you for saying that. And I do think there was kind of a cultural shift, and then the pandemic really shifted it. I also think that, or I see in my own clients, there's a generational, that the younger generation is really, seems to have a lot less taboos, and they're, open to therapy. And then I know like a lot of professional athletes have talked about mental health. And so it's just become kind of, in a good way, more people are talking about it. I also think, insurance companies have been really understanding people need support. And so there's been a lot more access, or some more access to support. Things are definitely shifting and changing in a good way in those terms. Yeah.
Oh, great. And what exactly do you do like now, and like what's been your path to get to this point?
Yeah. So right now I'm a therapist in private practice. I'm still virtual, and there's that aspect, which is so interesting. And I do really love it. I really care about my patients. And it's been a shift for me though. So I was a home hospice worker for 8 years. That was my training. I'm a social worker. I have a master's in social work. Then I passed the first exam. I got my license, and I worked for 8 years in home hospice, actually for like the largest home care agency in the country. And so it was amazing. I had a lot. As I told you, I wrote a book about my experience, and it's like rich, and parts of it are sad, but the book is like very real. So parts of it are also very grounding, and it's like it was just the experience of it, which we could talk about.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear more about that. And the book was with Death, Brooklyn, and the Gritty Side of Grace. Is that right?
Yeah. Death,
Excellent.
Brooklyn,
Okay.
and the Gritty Side of Grace. So it's very Brooklyn based, in that it really is about the environment of being here and what that feels like. And one of the things that I highlighted in it that you might find interesting is the hospice I worked for was all 5 boroughs, right? And I used to joke that I had the most diverse caseload of anyone else, which I don't know if that was true. But, I really worked, because of the neighborhoods that I covered in Brooklyn, I had patients in some very wealthy neighborhoods. I had, and I'm not, of course, going to name any names, but I had some celebrity patients or family members or pretty well-known people, a lot of people who, like I said, were pretty wealthy. And then I would have patients in a lot of all the major public housing. So like Marcy houses where Jay-Z grew up, Red Hook, Gowanus, all these, and then everybody in between. So it was a really rich experience. And I really loved it too, because I also had clients of all different backgrounds and certainly different languages. And I had gotten very into meditation, much into meditation at one point, into like kind of Buddhism. And then I had a client who was from Tibet, and her father was dying in the home, and she wanted to follow the Buddhist culture of how you leave the body in the home for a certain amount of days, which Americans are not used to doing that. And so I helped her find a funeral home that kept dad in the home after he had died for 3 days to, to honor their Buddhist culture. It was really a just rich experience.
Mm-hmm.
Really. Yeah. Really
Wow.
amazing.
I mean, I feel like we
Yeah.
could do a multi-part podcast series
Right.
on on your book. I mean, I guess just to kind of go like to like my first feeling is like, I mean, hospice work is, I mean, that's I don't know how to officially describe it, but I picture that being like home care for people who have pretty much been told they're going to die sometime soon. Is that a very inelegant way of describing it?
Oh, no. So thank you
Or
for
what does that
asking the
mean? Yeah,
question. No, you're right.
yeah.
I just dove in.
No, 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 no. Sorry. I'm just like I'm like the every man, I guess, in these kind of conversations.
No, you asked that. Thank you for asking that question. So yes, so what it is when someone gets a terminal diagnosis, and it tends to be for hospice, they do tend to be very end of life, and so it is people who've spoken, with their family, with their doctor, and they've decided that they are going to just be home, and they want to die comfortably at home with their family around them. Yeah.
And and your job, I imagine, is multifaceted. But I mean, I think like when my mother was diagnosed with like terminal cancer, like it seems to me like the things that were most daunting were like just the emotional part of it and like just the administrative part of it. Is like it's the way I think of the two different aspects of it. Are those the two principal like responsibilities you have? Are there other things that you're also involved with for people, like in a big picture sense?
So your questions are so spot on, and you're yeah, really, you're really, so yes. And yeah, so I was the team social worker, and so when someone comes on hospice, they of course get a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, and then if they want, the spiritual counselor. But the doctors don't really do the home visits. It's the nurse and the social worker who are really in the home and report back to the doctor. So yes, the social worker does a lot of what you were saying. We called it like psychoeducation, right? So we would help the nurse explain things to people. We had this wonderful doctor, but sometimes he would call in and try to explain things to the family in very medical terms, and I'd say, okay, so in layman terms, like translate
You're a
for the family.
translator.
So there was the psychoeducation piece, and then yes, absolutely. So the emotional piece. So grief counseling, or pre-bereavement, which is what we called it. So yes, I supported the family emotionally, and then the other piece, and we can talk about this a little bit, is and I just have a lot of emotions around it. So a big part of what a home hospice social worker does is prepare the family for the person's death, what's going to happen, what's that going to look like, but also all the funeral planning. And so we're very much, it's community-based work. I'm in the communities. I know a lot of the local funeral homes that people tend to use, often either by neighborhood or by culture, by religion, right? And so I had done that for 7 years, and I loved it, and I was told I was good at it. And then the pandemic hit, and that was so terrible. So in the New York Times did an article about a funeral home, the one they interviewed, which was one of many, one of some that had no place to put people's dead bodies. So that was a funeral home I knew really well. I had them on speed dial. They had me on speed. They had done me favors before with clients. I knew them. And so it was just really terrible. It's really terrible.
Yeah.
And it was really hard because it was a job that I had loved so much and had felt, when you have a job that you're good at and you feel good about and you feel you're helping people. And it was really, and then that just so quickly turned into just a really hard, time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a hard
In
time.
those situations, is it, does it lean one way or the other as far as who's having an actual harder time with the death? I'm sorry that it brings up
Yeah.
so much. So sorry. But like, is there, because I mean, you're stepping in and they're looking to you as like the, I guess almost like probably like the leader, like the tent pole, like
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
general, as far as a little bit. Um,
Yeah.
do you find that is it the person who's actually sick, I guess, having a more difficult time grappling with the prospects of their death, or is it the family that's dealing more with it, like the rest of their family, or is it both, or is it just kind of, it's really, you really can't, there is no trend, it's just case by case?
So what I loved about the work I did before and even the work I do now is that it's so individualized, right? And it's individualized by the age of the person who's dying, or the family members. It's individualized often by the actual disease. So there's many aspects. So it really depends. We had some clients who were 90, older people who either had kind of accepted it or they had long-term dementia or Alzheimer's. So that then a lot of the work would have, for me, was with the family, right?
Mhm.
But then you did have people who came onto hospice who were able to sit and have conversations and be like, I'm afraid to die, or what's going to happen. It's heartbreaking to work with a parent who has younger kids. It's so hard. And I would do some work with the children, but a lot of times it was with the parent, right? To be a
Mhm.
parent who knows you're going to leave, like 10-year-old, whatever, right? So it really depends on. But so to answer your question, um, when I got when I read the case notes, I would have an idea because I had done the work.
Okay.
So there was a pattern within, like I said, the diagnosis, how old the people were. We could. I often had an idea of what supports that they would need, um, based on those kinds of things. Yeah.
And what, I mean, is there something, I guess another, like, when people are confronting this, like, the most scary thing I guess you have in your life is the end of your life. Is there like, what kind of, like, what how are people like feeling, and how do they kind of come to terms with it? I mean, how do you come to terms with it, because you're living in this world too all the time? I mean, it's a scary thing. I mean, I don't know if certainly any of
Yeah.
us feel that, know what to think about it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's a little bit what my book is about too. So there were many different aspects. I think for some people, if people had been suffering for a long time, it was different. They had a different view of the end of their life. And then there were, like I said, older people who would say, I got to see my children, I got to see my grandchildren, grow up or whatever. So there, for some people, there was a sense of like a little bit of acceptance, or I'm going to be okay. Um, you know, it is interesting though. I remember we had this one client who everybody loved her. Every hospice worker and different team members had worked with her, and she was just this wonderful spirit. And she was probably only in her 40s, and she worked like part time almost to the end, which is really, really hard. And she just had this spirit where she was able to balance, like she wanted to try to live her life, but she also had some understanding of what was going to happen. And It was just so sad when she died. A lot of our staff and our team members were just so touched by her. It's the word kind of grace comes up. Is some
Mhm.
people just have this like. She really tried to make the most of the time that she had. Um, you know, but I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, but I guess to me, it's just I think that like when again being on watching as my mother was going through what she went
Yeah,
through in
yeah.
2018, like you're confronted with like the finite, like the finite aspect of your life, and I think I always find it like it is unsettling when you think about like there's going to be a world that continues on when I'm just gone, and I won't know what's going on. It's just going to end, and I think that's always like very frightening. And like when my mother was sick, I didn't even think I was in a position to ask her like how she's feeling. Like I didn't because I didn't know we weren't like didn't see her regularly. So like I didn't want to kind of dredge up like, Mom, how are you feeling? Do you want to talk about the prospects of death? Like I didn't just that didn't seem like a helpful way of doing it. If she wanted to talk about it, then obviously, I would be there, but I didn't think it was my place to ask her. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess I'm just like, I don't, you don't get to talk to somebody who like really as a profession, you're managing people's emotions around this. Like, so just kind of wondering like how people come to terms with it and how those families come to terms with it. And, I think usually when you deal with this, it's usually like when you're actually emotionally connected to it, right? When you're at somebody's funeral or you're told somebody that you love is terminally ill. But I guess this is a unique opportunity to kind of dwell on a very very serious topic without the immediate emotional connection to the topic itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's why I ask like how people come to terms. I mean, do people find religion at this point in their lives? Do they just kind of say, "Hey, I've done what I can and my body can't do anything else, so like this is it." Like that's what I think
Yeah.
about for me is like I feel like I wouldn't want to go back to any younger age. Like I'm like I think I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
want to do the 40s over again, the 30s, the 20s. Like I did
Mm-hmm.
what I could, and I can feel as my body slowly starts falling apart, like when those pains don't go
Mm-hmm.
away in my joints or whatever, that I could picture there being a point where it's just like, you know what, I've I've lived the life that I can, and those that youthful body that could do anything that's never
Mm-hmm.
coming back. So
Right.
I'm resigned to this, but not resigned in a bad way. Hopefully, like the sports analogy is like you want to kind of leave it all on the field, and I think
Mm-hmm.
I'd like that. I'd like to feel that whenever I have to deal with this, that I can be
Mm-hmm.
like, I did what I could and I did the best I could. And I'm sure it fell short, but you know, I'm getting a little emotional as I say that, but I think that's how I would deal with it. And I just wonder how you see other people dealing with it.
Yeah, and I think so. I do again, and the individual cases, like I said, come down to a little bit of like age and diagnosis. And there's certainly you are absolutely right that there are older people who are like, this thing just isn't working the way it did before, right? And there comes a point where the physical part of it feels like, I do think people often at that stage get to a point where they're ready to go. And I wanted to say, you just made me think of something else too. Um, Wait, what did you say before about um,
Like leaving it on the field,
yeah,
the aches and pains that don't go away. Your
right.
mind.
Um, so I do think there is a bit of a process, like I said, for people who, when you get, there is something of like at a certain, often when people are older, there's this idea of like, right, like I either did the best I could. Oh, here's what I was going to say is like, the other thing is that people do really tend to die the way they lived. And we didn't experience anyone who, like, all of a sudden found religion or found it really wasn't like that. Like I said, it seems like the way that you had lived your life in so many aspects reflected the way that you died. The only thing I will say is, as I kind of touched on before, when you have a younger person, when you have a parent who's leaving kids behind, it's a lot different because you want to be there for your kids.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's just, I think so much of it is like, you want to fight, you want to be there, you want to stay, which I get. Of course, right? So
Yeah.
that's a lot different. But as you said, there is kind of this, when you're over a certain age, or your kids are if you had kids there, then you get into a little bit different idea of like what you're saying of like, my body really isn't functioning the way. The other thing we often talk about in hospice is like, so sometimes the person who's dying is afraid to upset the caregivers or the family, or vice versa. The caregivers and the family don't want to upset but often people know what's going on in their body, right?
Yeah.
They really, and so sometimes I think by the time they get to hospice and a doctor gives them a diagnosis and blah, 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 or, they're like, I kind of saw this coming. I know my body. I know what I'm feeling. I mean, maybe I didn't know like directly it was this, but like I know that I'm, things are changing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's very true, that people often can trust their body and know what's going on in their body, but they don't want to upset their son who came to visit or something. And then sometimes the son doesn't want to upset mom, right? So it's a different place of communication. So to your point, that was my job, is like I could give people a space to be like, look, if you want to talk about, are you afraid to die? What are the things you're afraid of? Tell me the specifics. I can be with you, be in this space with you and listen to these things. If you don't want to tell your kids or your grandkids and you're worried about upsetting them, I'm the person you can share this with.
And how did you're in this world for for 8 years you were doing
Mhm.
hospice work. How did that impact you and your feelings? Like, you know, like I mean, I imagine that's got to have some kind of transformative impact on you.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely hard to, at first. And the book is a little bit about when I first started the work and when I started to like um, be in a job and in a position where people talked about death and dying on a regular basis. And, in your computer software, it was, people who were dying. And then if someone died, they wouldn't show up anymore. They showed up and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Like it was really, it is a really big adjustment, right? You're like, and then within a year, it is interesting because you get to this space where like, so when someone would die, once in a while we would already be in the home, or they would come and one of us would go. And usually it was the social worker or the spiritual care counselor who would go to the family's home when the person died. They would call our service, right? And it was usually one of us, not a nurse. So I did what we called were death visits. So I would do a lot of death visits and be there in the home with the family. With the family member's dead body. And I do remember like the first time is it, like you said, it's transformative, right? It's like what does this really mean that this person has left, and I say to people, I don't follow any religious, I don't want to say doctrine, but I just don't follow any religion. But I couldn't come out of doing hospice and not feel spiritual, because it's just being with the families, being with someone at end of life. The other thing I always say, and I don't know if people get this, but like to me, um, end of life is more of an art than a science. And I think even, it's a lot of, there are doctors involved, but it's very much the nurses and the social workers. And there's like a lot of intuition, and there's like a very creative process that you go through because you have to be very attuned to your clients. And I remember this happened a number of times, but I was working with this young couple in Williamsburg. The wife was dying. She was like, I don't know, I can't remember, 30s. But I said it was sad. They didn't have kids, but they were young. They lived in this cool neighborhood. And I remember saying to the I was really doing my best to prepare the husband, who was this young hipster guy. And I remember saying at one point, I said, she really only has a few weeks. It could be two. And then we went back and and then one time I said, I think it's going to be this weekend. I just want you to be prepared. I'm not working. Are you prepared? She died that weekend. And I called him on Monday. I said, cause we have other staff. We're 24 hours, but I called him. I said, are you okay? I'm here. And the first thing he said to me is like, you were right. And I'm like, okay, well, it's not about being right, but it's about the intuition. What's happening. You're attuned to your clients and your patients, and you're there to support them in this way. And I wanted to support him as much as I could. So being with him through all those phases and giving him the information as we went along, and then he thanked me and he's like, no, you did support me. It was really helpful. But there's a little bit of a creative energy to doing this work. And anyway, so to answer your question, yes, it was transformative because you're kind of tapping into it's creativity, and there's also something very grounded about it too, like um there's one thing I talk about in the book is, so there is this spiritual aspect, and then there's like the physical decay of the body that you're witnessing and watching, and so those two things together are really kind of profound, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
um,
I guess in some respects, the great like equalizer is death,
right,
right?
right.
And everybody's subject to it, and everybody um, goes through the same emotions, even though we all think that things are different, and there certainly are
Mhm.
different circumstances. At the
Right.
end of the day, that pain and anguish is pretty, so it hits everybody somehow. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
the what I found, like, just in that my little dabbling in, like, I mean, just in the world that you lived in for 8 years, like my Miranda, my daughter, was like also having like kind of her own little like existential crisis going through this.
Mhm.
It was the first time she was confronted with death and where she could think about it, and I think we ended up talking about like the meaning of life,
Mhm.
and like
Yeah.
like what I I was like, and I was like, that's a good question, because I'm like walking around the streets of New York City and I feel utterly detached from like everything, because I don't know if that's a common thing or whatever, but I just remember like walking around Soho and just kind of feeling like everything seems so frivolous and like silly and so insignificant. Like I just like was thinking about it like being a little piece of dust on a piece of dust floating around in this like universe, and like what's the meaning of everything. And what I settled on, and I'm just curious here to hear what you think, was like, to me, the meaning of life is like really about making as many positive human connections as you can. That's what I said, Brandon. And I thought, to me, that kind of like gives leeway to be who you are, because you can be an extrovert and that might mean something very different than being an introvert. If you're an introvert, that might just mean four people. Like it doesn't, you know what I mean? But that's the meaning of life, is striving to have those positive human connections. And I think there was like kind of like the relativistic aspect to that, because it's really, there is no right or wrong. It's just about having a positive impact. And I think, to me, when I thought about like death then and like the finality, I kind of also was real, to me at least, I was like, it's only final if you look at things in like a three-dimensional way. But if you think about the impact that people have once they're gone, you just have to look at the world not in three dimensions, but in like five or six or whatever it is, to realize that that person is still there, and it's not just like a corny thing. It's like they literally are still having an impact on you. And the other part of it is like, you know, it could be children, but it doesn't have to be, because if you had people that you mentored, those people go on and they have an impact, and they're your legacy. And that, to me, was why I felt like the positive connections matter, because it's not just about like having kids. Kids is one way of having it, but there are so many other ways to leave that kind of like lasting legacy. And I think that's like kind of, I guess, the most relativistic like standard that I could think of that was still kind of hopeful and like, I guess, positive for humanity and for me to get by. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but
Yeah.
that's how at least I grappled with it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It definitely doesn't have to be children. And I just want to add, because I was trained as a social worker, and social work has this rich history. History of it's not only mentorship, it's internship, it's really bringing up the next generation, and it's a whole. And I do believe in that.
Yeah.
That's been. I mean, that's part of my training is you help the new young. You train the next generation, and so that is a big part of our.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, right? It can be this, and it doesn't have to be within your field, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's a. But no, but going back to what you're saying, I mean, so there's a couple things. So and again, I do talk about this in my book. I know I keep
Yeah.
referring to
Yeah.
it,
No.
but
Do you have a copy
one,
of it?
I do. I'll be sending you one.
Yeah.
But the audiobook is available.
Okay.
We'll shamelessly promote it
No, you
later.
can plug it. You can plug it right now if you want, because
Okay.
it sounds like really gripping good material
So
to
yeah,
read.
it's on Audible. It is on
Uh,
Audible, available on Audible, Death Brooklyn and the Gritty Side of Grace.
uh,
So one of the reasons I ended up kind of going towards hospice is because I had been doing meditation. I did yoga, then I did meditation, then I started kind of learning about Buddhism. And so one thing I just wanted to, well, two things to share with you is like, there is this idea of interconnectedness, that we are connected, or, you know, understanding, acknowledging, and feeling that we're connected to other people. And I do agree with what you're saying about making positive connections, actually talking to people and connecting to people. I also feel very much that and I love what you're doing with the trips to South Carolina and reaching out to people and all of these. This is the manifestation or the physical. I also think it kind of has to start like I do it sitting on the mat. When I do my little meditation, how can I be connected to people? How can I send love and good energy to, part of it is, people in Ukraine, people in Florida, anywhere, kind of starting with me and starting from this place of like, um, just for a minute. And again, I do it from a spiritual place. I'm not necessarily religious, but like spending, 30 seconds, like, there are people out there suffering in my own country. How can I send them good energy or whatever? And I think that is kind of the root of what you physically are doing with reaching out to people, and you want to connect to people. So starting with that kind of groundedness and thinking of others is how I got into this. And I, interestingly, we were talking about when people get to end of life. So one of the things is, how do we prepare for getting to end of life while we're still living, right? Making the most of the life we have now, whether you're in your 30s or your 50s, or you're a healthy 70-year-old running around. And interestingly, so in some Buddhist countries, they supposedly they think about death and dying 5 minutes every day. I don't know if that's exactly true, but I do know that they have a very different view of death and dying. It's very much talked about with children. It's very open. And someone told me that there's an app on your phone that reminds you to think about death and dying every day.
oh darn, that would have been such the way to make a killing. I think that's called the newspaper.
Well, right. I
Have
mean,
you changed? Like, is there anything that you do that that change what you do because of
yeah,
that?
I mean, I do. So I do. I mean, I do really think it is this idea of, like you were saying, it is the great equalizer. So,
Yeah.
and I know, I don't want to get into politics or anything, but we do live in a time that's very polarized, right? And it is, how do we find those pieces of compassion or humanity to connect to other people, right? And as you said, it is, I'm going to say it, we are all going to die one day, right? And there is something to um, taking a breath and breathing into that and saying, I'm going to use that knowledge to make the most of the time I have now, to try to have a positive impact, whatever that means, right? And to try to look at other human beings in a human way too.
Mm.
So, and that's hard. I mean, it's hard. The other piece that I want to say is, because so much of end of life is actually your whole life. And so what I mean by that is like the people who are around you at the end of your life have to do with how you lived your life, you know? Um, if you had a lot of conflict with your kids, one of your adult kids might not show up. Or, it's a reflection of your life, right? And it's interesting too, because in social work, I mean, in any kind of that kind of helping work, you have to pick a population to work with, right? There are people who work in schools, there are people who work with veterans, there are people who work, there were people who worked, with HIV, whatever. There are these, and so what I said though is, since everybody dies, I've actually worked with all these populations.
Mm.
So it covers all of our life, right? Um, and so it is this idea like of you, I guess what you're saying, it is this kind of great equalizer, right? We see so many different kinds of people, and we work with so many different kinds of people. And I just want to say, because I was in Brooklyn, our staff was extremely diverse. And so that was like a really great learning experience for me too. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I really loved that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and we should talk about what you're doing now, definitely. But like to me, the last thing that one of the things that you mentioned is just like I think there are a lot of people who work in like offices, right? And if you go from
Right.
your home to your office, whether it's by Uber, Subway, whatever, it's a very limited perspective on human existence. Um,
Right.
I was at least out selling wine for 12 years, going out in different places, and you encountering lots of people in all different neighborhoods. You were doing that to an even higher degree, kind of seeing that diversity of ethnicity, of economics, of like society, of cultures, religions, which must have been just such a fascinating insight. Um, how does it all carry on to what you're doing now as with your own private practice?
Yeah. So in my private practice now, I do work with people who, I do grieving and death and dying. However, since the pandemic, a lot of people have anxiety. So I'm working with a lot of people who have anxiety. And part of it too, though, is people are grieving either their way of life from before, or trying to readjust to how life was. I think there's just still a lot of grief around a lot of things. So even though it's not directly about someone who died in their life, it's just this whole idea of like, change, and the world changed, and how do we kind of cope and adapt with that. And part of it is grieving, and then part of it is just like the change of it all.
Yeah.
um yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Like one of the things I think you were talking about, like it being polarized, and like in some respect, like I don't. I think that we're seeing more of the disagreement and the anger and the frustration that I think people had, and I think that there are powers that be that are using that to polarize us. But
Hmm.
like kind of like my feeling and talking about like what you're referring to is like in some respects like with my wife, like there are times like when we might be having a fight, and then if you just step back for a second, we're like, oh wait a second, like we haven't gotten more than 4 hours of sleep for like 4 nights in a row. Like when this
Yeah.
isn't about this is about something, a bigger macro issue. And I
Yeah.
think for me, when we think about what's been going on, like in some respect, I think we need to cut ourselves, like everybody, wherever you are, like some slack, because not only was like there a pandemic, but like, bigger picture, I mean, technology is this totally new paradigm for human connectedness. Before there was
Yeah.
an internet, I mean, how many people did you have to manage? How many people were you in touch with, right? I mean, you could leave your
Right.
hometown and move on to someplace else and you'd be totally forgotten and you could reinvent your own world. You didn't go out and you weren't confronted with the emotions of hundreds of people on Facebook or thousands of people or thing. You didn't, we're bombarded now with the thoughts of a country of 330 million, if not a world of 8 billion, and that's a
Right.
lot to take on. Right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
like in some respect, like I don't necessarily, I will buy that it feels more polarized, but I think that we should step back and give ourselves some slack that we're dealing with something truly revolutionary, and we're going to have to learn to. I feel like the entire world, humanity, needs its own therapist to like talk it through this. Like, yo, chill out. Like, this is some serious shit you're going through. Like, I can curse because this is a podcast. Like, this is some serious shit we're going through for everybody, wherever you are. You're poor, you're rich, you're black, you're white, you're Jewish, you're whatever. Like, this is hard. Even in your own little circle, it's hard to get thoughts of like hundreds of people that live in our neighborhood in Cobble Hill. It's hard enough to live with my family of 5, right? Much less the building. Like our building has this email board, and it was blowing up because of some project, and like all of a sudden, all that unpleasantness you're getting, and in the
Yeah.
past that never existed. And
Yeah.
we all have to learn to go from that unpleasantness about our condo board to the unpleasantness of our school to the unpleasantness of whatever, because there are things that people are trying to fix.
Right.
And I don't think we spend enough time celebrating the good things, which is why I wanted to have you on here, because like people like you and people like you've been like those, like that saving grace, that like lifesaver. You've been like the hero to people, and I think we need to turn the lens onto all the good that's out there in the world and celebrate that a lot more, and stop dwelling on the bad, because there is bad, but there's a lot of good, and we need to balance the bad with all the good that I think we're overlooking for all that silliness.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. And you're right. There are a lot of people out there who, want to really try to like, um, yeah, do good, or are helpers, or want to like serve others, and I agree with you. I think that maybe this term, a strengths-based perspective, right? So that's like a therapy term, but you're working from a strengths-based perspective, which is very adaptive coping. And I hear you, and I think that some in therapy, and even in the work I did before, a lot of it is like you said, like I do celebrate with my clients progress, or we do always try to look at the things that have been working or are working, or how do you support those systems that are in place that are positive. I hear you. It's true. And you're right. It is a hard time with social media and all of these things. And one thing I also talk to my clients about is sometimes like taking a media diet, doing a media diet, because it's such an inundation sometimes of so much information.
Yeah, that's a great idea. What do you suggest to them?
People do things in different ways. I mean, I'm not in for this. Sometimes I've had clients, I agree, I think like baby steps, but some people will just totally delete a social media app right off their phone. They're like, I don't want to look at it. I don't want to do it. And then in 2 days they'll put it back on, and then they'll take it off, and which is fine. People have to do. I've turned off news alerts sometimes on my phone so that I can manage when I want to read the news and it just doesn't kind of come up.
Yeah.
These kinds of things. But it's also right. So much information is coming at us, right?
Yeah, yeah. I removed Facebook from my phone, and I don't even can't even say necessarily that I consider Facebook that poisonous, at least where I am right now. I just wanted to have at least one less thing to distract me when I'm out and about, and
Mm-hmm.
excuse me, it definitely makes a difference. So
Um,
yeah.
yeah, but I do hear you about like, yeah, it's an overload of things. Wait, I have to just share with you. I just had
Yeah.
a deja vu.
Oh, what was that? Wait, wait.
um, can I just take the conversation in a slightly different? So one of the
Sure.
things
Yeah.
I have been doing, as a therapist, you do work on yourself. And so I've started doing a lot of work with Carl Jung. Do you know who Carl? Yeah.
I remember from my 12th grade psychology class the name. I can't say much more than I know that he's like one of the leading figures in psychology.
Historically, yeah. Like first there was Freud, and then he was younger and he worked with Freud, and then they split. And so I'm doing like a lot of dream work, and I'm doing a lot of this work with the unconscious, and part of it is I'm also doing a lot of meditation, and sometimes I've been having more deja vus. It's really
Oh,
weird.
wow. Did you have a deja vu of us doing a podcast before?
No, but it was the specific thing we were just talking about, like
Oh,
really
wow.
specifically whatever that topic was, like
Yeah.
2 minutes ago.
Uh-huh.
It's very jarring, actually,
Yeah.
because I'm like, it feels like we actually are really already anyway. So there's like all this kind of. It's been really interesting and really fun. Not part of it has been fun, and part of it has been like really emotional and really deep for me.
Yeah.
It's really interesting work. Anyway.
So you had a prior career that's very different than doing hospice work or therapy. What did you do before? And
Yeah. I mean, it was different, but in a way, I feel like it wasn't that different. So right. So I graduated from NYU Film School. Um, and I worked in TV commercials for quite some time. I worked on some like really big commercials, and I did a lot of like Maybelline and fashion stuff. And I worked with some like famous supermodels of the 90s and did a lot of production work. And yeah, I know it feels very different. But as I was saying, when I was in film school, I studied a lot of writing, and that creative piece, like I was saying, I feel like the creativity um, of film and what I did before connected. There's also something really, I'm not going to explain this right. It's going to sound really weird, but there's something about like being on a film set and being in like, it's not a real job. I mean, you get paid, but it's not like the standard job. And this is a crazy thing I'm going to say, but being on a film set and doing those kind of creative things really helped me when I was like in a person's home and they were dying, which might just sound crazy. I'm not sure.
Mhm. Was it a sense of kind of removing yourself from what was happening in front of you, or was it control, like you being able to control your emotions separate from what was happening in front of you, or what how did
I
that?
don't, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Maybe it was, I don't know. Like you're there, you're working, you're in this environment. You don't really have control, but you're there kind of because I was in production, right? So you're kind of
Right.
supporting what's going on. Um,
You might have
and
people dying on the set or something, and you don't actually, you're detached from that enough to not let it bother you. Is that
no, I
not literally dying on the set, but
don't, no. Yeah, I don't know. It was something about that they're, I don't know. Neither of them were like sitting in an office job. It was like,
yeah.
oh, it was like you're doing things and you're uh I'm not sure. Anyway,
Okay. Yeah.
um yeah. Um so yeah, very different. I know
Hmm.
it was the work was yeah, very different in some ways, right?
And then what made you start thinking about doing something else, and then what led you into doing social work?
Well, I had started working on some like kind of more documentary pieces. Um, and then I really wanted to take my career more into like a documentary kind of nonprofit kind of way. I don't know, career. And I was working on a documentary. I was the production manager. I don't know, whatever. And it was very emotional. And this woman was being interviewed, and we were in her home, and she was telling her experience. But she had this huge dog, and I don't know how it ended up happening, but I think the dog was trying to move towards her, and the cameraman was like, "Get the dog out." So I went to grab the dog, but it was like really big and strong, and then like one of the production assistants, or maybe he was one of the like gaffers or one of the grips, I guess, what like also grabbed the dog. And so the two of us, like the frame was up here, but we were on under the frame, under the camera, holding this dog. But we were waiting for the interview to end, and I'm like here, and the guy, I mean, I knew him, but I was like, I'm sitting here and I'm looking at him, and he's like, and we're like, well, and the dog's like, and I'm like, whatever. And I was like, um, you know, I want to be the person actually like making the changes in the world, not just being interviewed about them.
Right.
Because this woman's story was really important, and or what, and I was like, I'm just recording or whatever, people's stories, but I want to have a story to tell. I want to do something in the world.
Mhm.
And that, I remember that thought going through my mind as I'm like holding onto this dog. We were like laying on her floor. Whatever, production's
Yeah.
crazy. And I was doing more meaningful work at that time. Like I said, these documentaries, but I was like, no, I want to have a story. And so when I was deciding to go back to social work school, I told my mom, and she's like, oh yeah, I always thought you'd do something like that. What took you so long? I'm like, thanks, mom. Like, why? Because in high school, I had been very I had actually done like not only a lot of volunteer work, and this was before volunteer work was mandatory. I just did it because I was really, I mean, it's the path I wanted to be on. And I worked I grew up in Cincinnati, and I volunteered at, there was a homeless shelter, and then part of it was the, feeding people, and I was very involved, and it was a whole big thing, and it was a whole great place. And anyway, I spent like junior and senior year, I spent a lot of time there. And so my mom, yeah, I mean, I could see her point. I had been like really into that work. And I also think I always have had like a sense of social justice. And even though I'm doing therapy now, social work has a rich history and meaning around social justice. And that is important to me.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I remember one this when my mother's going through it, but like who is the insurance companies are paying for you as the social worker for
Mm-hmm.
the hospital care, but like in general, like if a social worker is doing any of the other, like you said, there was other types of work you could do, right? Like a
Mm-hmm.
hospital or, and that's all just paid for by insurance, or are
Mm-hmm.
there like nonprofits that also, or is that like, how does that work?
It's usually part of insurance.
Mm.
Yeah, usually social work is a part of, uh, and a lot of in hospice, a lot of our clients were on Medicare,
Mm-hmm.
or which is basically an insurance, right? So
Mm-hmm.
no, it was all insurance. So but I do hear, yeah, I mean, you're right. There are social workers in different settings. I mean, school social workers are paid through, obviously the DOE, and
Mm-hmm.
in a hospital, though, think I actually don't know how a hospital works. Hospice actually is a very new and different model of care, and it's from England. It started in England in the 19th, but it's new even to them. Like the modern hospice started in England in the 1960s. It's brand new, and it came here around the 80s, 90s even. It's really new, and it's a unique model of care that none of the rest of our healthcare system follows. I don't know, it's kind of interesting. I could talk about it, but basically what you do is when you go on hospice, it's different than like regular doctor's appointments, or I think even if you have cancer treatment, how they pay for each thing kind of individually. So when you come on hospice, there's a lump sum that's paid from your insurance company or from Medicare to the hospice for the month. And then under that, you get all these different services. You can have the nurse come as much or as little as she needs to, the doctor, the social worker. You could get the spiritual counselor. You don't have to. You get a hospital bed. You get all the medication. You get the supply. So there's certain things that are covered under this lump sum, but they don't pay for everything individually, which is a totally different model than any other, financial medical model we have.
Mm-hmm. And then when you, I guess, going back to like what your role is now, are there, um, what's the difference between you as a psychotherapist
Mhm.
versus like a psychoanalyst or a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Like how do you fall
Yeah.
into that?
Yeah, I mean, a psychiatrist is a doctor, and they prescribe medication. And not as many psychiatrists. Some psychiatrists do therapy these days, but a lot don't. So a lot of times you'll go to see a psychiatrist and they'll really kind of just do the medication part. Um, uh, a psychoanalyst is, wait, you asked me the different ones.
So
So a
like psychiatrists, and
psychologist,
these
oh
might not even
yeah,
be the right way to
yeah,
categorize
yeah,
it, but this
yeah.
is how
No,
I
that's
think
right.
about it.
So a lot of psychologists can do, especially when it comes to kids, they do a lot of testing. They'll do like ADHD testing or help kind of with that kind of a diagnosis. I can't do that. I don't want to do
Hmm.
that, which is
Hmm.
fine. I mean, I just do pure therapy. That's all. But psychologists can do a lot more tests. They do a lot of testing and that kind of thing. And they have, so a psychiatrist is an MD, a psychologist is a PhD. A psychoanalyst is probably also a PhD, and they're therapists, but they just studied a very specific. They went through an analysis program, and that's the kind of therapy that they do is psychoanalysis, which is great. It's great. That was really used a lot. I mean, people still do it, but therapy has also kind of changed and morphed since then too. So it's a little bit different than some of the therapy maybe that I do, but there's some overlap too.
Hmm.
There's some overlap,
Okay.
right?
Um, and then what is there? Do you find that social and like what you're doing now, is social media kind of rearing its ugly head in a lot of your sessions? And like one thing I've wondered is like, could you actually help? Could it help you to diagnose somebody or treat somebody by like following them on like Instagram or Twitter on Facebook? Like, would that actually give you useful insights? So you'd be like, okay, so let's talk about your little rant on Twitter at Tuesday night at 11 o'clock. Well, what was going on there? And should we? Maybe is that something that people should pay more attention to? Because it's like people are like acting like they're unguarded.
Well, that's a good question. I will say yes, it has absolutely reared its ugly head in sessions with my clients where people. So something that's very common is that people compare themselves to other people, right? So then they're on social media and then they see this friend got a new job or this friend got engaged or this person da 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 da, and then they start to feel bad about themselves. And often the things that are most triggering are the thing that they are working on, right? So if I don't know, if I have a client who has a great job, but they're upset about being single, and then a friend gets engaged, they're, upset, right? And so social media really is like, it can be, and clients have said, like, I was starting to not feel great, and then I made the mistake. I went on social media. I knew I shouldn't have done it. And then it made me feel really more depressed, right? So it just kind of can really trigger people in that way. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we do talk about social media a lot.
Insecurities, like I mean, I actually I did a social media like reboot. Like I basically like just shut down my old platform because I was like, there's a whole lot of like negativity and grappling with things in there. I want to leave that behind me. Can you hold on 1 second, because I have a child who forgot her keys and is ringing the doorbell, and I think soon there's going to be some very loud banging. So to all the listeners out there, I apologize. I'm gonna have to step off for 1 second. I'll be right back. Well, we made it 29 episodes before I got interrupted by somebody coming home from school without their keys. So that's pretty good. Sorry. So we were talking about social media and like the how it plays to our insecurities.
Yeah. I think it can be really, I don't want to say damaging, but like I said, I think if someone's starting to, not feel it's just, it's not always great. for sure.
The I listen to sports radio in the mornings because
Hmm.
it's something I've stopped listening to the regular news since March. But I listen to sports radio just to kind of have something to listen to while I'm washing dishes, making breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever. And one of the things that's really fascinating is like if you listen to people's emotions, people
Hmm.
really we're very simple minded in a lot of respects. Like it's like you get that one data point and then like you see that one
Hmm.
post by that one person, and all of a sudden everything else you know about the world and all the work that you put in is completely meaningless, and you're just a complete loser because you're not away on vacation in the Croatia or whatever. You're not having some exotic
Right.
vacation, and you're a loser because of that one little data point. And like what
Hmm.
I'll see with like sports is like, your team can win 10 games in a row, but they lose one, all of a sudden they suck, they're the worst team
Right.
ever. Right?
Right.
Or if they're losing all these games or they win one, all of a sudden they're the best. Everything, we're turning it around. Like I can see it. This is finally, we're going to put this 10-year curse behind us, and that's not it at all. And I don't know. I know humans are very complicated, but I feel like there is that kind of common element is that we're so inclined to grab onto the things that are more immediate without putting them into context. And I think that's one of
Hmm.
the things that has really kind of, I think, depolarized my brain is there is have you ever heard of the David Foster Wallace speech, "This is water"?
Yes, 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 I
Yeah,
have.
yeah.
Yeah,
So that
yeah,
idea of like perspective
right.
is, I guess, kind of analogous to that, because the idea of like understanding there's more going on than you think, and you have to give credit to either the fact that there's a lot more that you don't know that you should learn, or just
Hmm.
be like, I don't know everything that's going on, so I need to not be as upset about this because I just don't understand the full picture. Um, I don't know if that helps, but I think that's at least kept me from going insane. Plus, not following the news for the last 6 months.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I do. Um, yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I do think there is, I mean, what I was going to say is that one of the modalities I'm trained in is called IFS, internal family systems, and it works with our different parts, right? And you're right. So sometimes that part will take over the part of like, that's so triggered by something, and then we start to either spiral or we have these we perseverate, right? So the thought goes over and over and over, and it's like working, like you said, what is the bigger picture, right? Whether it's like, um, I know that I'm not in Croatia on vacation and there's a part of me that's maybe burnt out, but then I have all these other, all these other things, right? But it is hard. I think it can be very hard for people, because we get stuck in that, right? As we, the kind of spiral or something. So
yeah,
you're right. There is a way to like kind of, how can we step back from it and not be so like attached to these kinds of
yeah.
thoughts?
But
Yeah.
but I think even that insight is useful, because I find for me it's like, just if you just understand that, okay, sometimes you do that. I think there's
Hmm.
sometimes there's a drive that can be too much to be like, oh, I've got to be perfect, or I shouldn't do this. But it's like, you know what, you're a human being. You're
Hmm.
fucked up like everybody else. I mean, like you got problems, like you do.
Yeah.
We're screwed up. We're far from perfect. So when you're doing those things, also cut yourself some slack. Say, yeah, no, I was in a bad spot and life isn't perfect. And I mean, it's so much harder than obviously just saying that. But I feel like it's definitely not. Sometimes we make things more complicated than they are. Sometimes we make them more simple than what they are. But to me, the simplicity here is to deal with the complexity. I don't know if that makes
Ooh.
any difference. It's
Oh
a
my.
very Zen type thing, isn't it? A Buddhist
The
type thing.
Yeah. Say that. Whoa. Say that again.
The simplicity is to deal with the complexity.
Okay. I'm going to steal that. No. I'll give you credit. I'll give you
Yeah.
credit.
No.
I think that should be your tagline.
Yeah, I've had a lot of different taglines. I think Christy's like really sorry. Is tired of hearing about all my different taglines. No,
Okay,
I.
I vote for that one.
All right. No, I've settled my tagline, or at least my mantra, has been just is trying to give, and that's why I finish these podcasts with just trying to give everybody unconditionally compassion, respect. I mean, curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility.
Mm.
And I think, that unconditionally obviously means, you may not be conditioned because we're humans and we're flawed, but, trying as much as you can to do that. And so I guess that if I had to have a tagline, that would be it, but it's not very hashtagable, but I think it's useful. so, um, so, but we've crossed over the 1 hour mark, and I'm sure you have, many other things to do. I guess to wrap up, can I just ask you, like, what gives you hope at the end of the day?
Hmm. Yeah, what gives me hope at the end of the day? I'm really, so this is the truth. Like, I get very inspired by my own clients. And it is really, seeing people like working through things and being able to overcome things, and like just how you said that brilliant thing just now about simplicity, and my clients come up with these things and I'm like, that's brilliant, like that's like, so I think for me hope is like people are, I mean, everyone used the word resilient, right? But I don't, people are, they want to really, um, do I want to say they want to, I don't know if I want to say they want to be better, but I think there's this like um, human spirit that we do want to either connect or improve or get along, or some people might say love each other, whatever this is. And it just, at the end of the day, it's really hopeful to see like my clients, I see that in them, and then it feeds me, right? And it's probably mutual. I think we all kind of nourish, I guess we all kind of nourish each other, is what makes me feel very hopeful.
I think you touched upon something I was thinking about the other day, which I think is like, I think we get too caught up a lot of times in looking at labels, right? Like, oh, this person must be smart because they have a degree from such and such, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that when you do that, you lose sight of the fact that sometimes somebody deserves your respect because of the struggle and because of how they live their
Mm-hmm.
lives, which I think
Yeah.
it sounds like that's the insight that you're gaining is you're past the labels to just see how somebody's trying, and there is a certain like nobility in trying the best you can, whether or not you achieve that goal. And it's a really beautiful insight from you. So thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, I know you want to wrap up, but it's true. I mean, even people who do have the, I don't know, fancy school or fancy this or what, the work I do is really about almost about these other things, right? So you can even be really smart, but there's still like human things that so many of us want to work on or want to improve or kind of struggle with. And it's the human parts that are hopeful, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. All right. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much. It's been really great to chat with you for such an extended amount of time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great. It really was great. I appreciate
All
it.
right. Well, thank you. And thank you to our listeners for listening. And may you go out and enjoy exploring our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Take care. Thanks.